Welcome to this presentation regarding using Microsoft Word. Let's get started. I'm going to start by sharing my desktop with you so you'll be able to see what I can see. So now you ought to be able to see my desktop. And let me go ahead and get into a Word document. Okay. Let me first of all begin with a disclaimer. I have used Word for lots of years, but I am by no means a Word expert. I have never attended a class, and I have only kind of a practical hands-on experience with it. If you have more experience than me, and that wouldn't surprise me a bit if you do, you may well know quicker or easier ways of doing the things that I'm going to be doing. Please do those things, and if you know about them, let me know so that I can learn how to do this better. So I always like to start with that disclaimer because sometimes I embarrass myself when I discover that there's easier and smarter ways of doing things. One thing that might come up when we're going through this presentation is you might look at something and go, well, I know how to do it, and it's going to be similar to the way Professor Gruber does it. My caveat with that is that when I'm grading things, many times for this class, I expect that the documents look very, very much the way that I have given guidance regarding it. So if you do something kind of similar, but it's not exactly the same, and it causes the words to be somewhat differently placed on the document, you may find that you get a deduction. And so if it's going to give you the same look, then please use the shortcut and tell me about it. If it's going to give your document a similar but not identical look, you may not want to use that approach, or you may want to talk to me about it and see if that's going to work for the particular document. I encourage students for this class to use Microsoft Word, if at all possible. The reason for that is that the things that I'm going to be showing you are functionalities within Microsoft Word. If you're using WordPerfect or some other word processing system, it may be more challenging to get the documents to look exactly the same way that I am setting it up. In some cases, it may be impossible to because of the particular functionalities of the word processing system. In other cases, it may just involve using a different path. Submissions that you make for this class need to be in either .doc, .docx, or .pdf. I strongly prefer these two, and as we go through it, I think it'll become obvious why I prefer these two to PDF. When you submit a document in .doc or .docx, I can see the formatting. When you PDF a document, I lose the ability to see formatting, so it requires more effort on my part to figure out exactly how you did the things that you did. I can overcome them, but it's certainly appreciated if you're able to produce documents in .doc or .docx. But again, if you're using some other word processing system like WordPerfect or some other program, and you don't have the ability to use .doc or .docx, PDF is an acceptable alternative. Please don't submit any document with suffixes other than these three unless you've talked with me about it and we figured out a way around that particular problem. If I can't easily open the document, I'm not going to be able to grade it, and the date that it's submitted is the date that I need to be able to open it. So I don't want you to lose credit for an assignment that you've worked hard on. So keep that in mind. Make sure that your documents have these formattings. I had an unfortunate situation happen one semester with a student, and that student submitted a temporary file, and it began with a $sign, and then it had some text, and I think it actually had, I'm not sure exactly what it had after, but something like that. she thought she was submitting her homework when in fact she was submitting a temporary file. If you see a document name starting with a $, it is not actually the document that you've been working on. It looks like it, it's just the first letters are moved and the $sign replaces it. That will be an empty file, and I won't be able to grade that, and I won't be able to give you credit for it. So check for that when you make your submission. Another suggestion that I have is that you make sure you save a copy of the document. Sometimes strange things happen when you're using Blackboard or sometimes a word processing system. And so if you submit something and there's some technical difficulty, it's possible that I may give you a chance to submit another copy of it. What I'm not going to be able to do, though, is give you an opportunity to recreate the document. You're going to have it, and you're going to have to show me that you have that document. And so if you've saved it, you can save it to a hard drive, you can save it to a thumb drive, or you can just email it, the document, to yourself as an attachment. All those would be fine approaches. Then in the event that there's some issue about the document and how it loaded or something like that, you have the ability to show me, yes, and here is the document I intended to post, and somehow or another something went awry. So be sure that you don't erase or delete that document, at least until you have a grade for that particular assignment. And ideally that you keep it for the whole semester, because one never knows when issues might come up. So those are some pointers about saving documents. Another thing, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation, but we'll talk about some aspects of it now. We'll just talk about some aspects of it later on. We're going to talk about how to change some of the default settings that we have in Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word is a very robust word processing system. It is designed, not surprisingly, for your general Microsoft user who isn't a legal professional. Legal professionals certainly use Microsoft Word, but they aren't the majority of the users. So while Microsoft Word will meet the needs of a legal professional, it's not focused on the needs of a legal professional. An example of a word processing suite that is really designed to meet the needs of legal professionals is WordPerfect. There was a time where most legal professionals used WordPerfect. That's not true anymore. There certainly are some that do, but it's not nearly the kind of gold standard that it once was. So we're going to talk about ways that we can use Word but make it kind of more, I would say, legal friendly, or at least more customizable. The first thing I want to show you is when we're looking at home base for Word, there is in the font section, you'll see this little box here. It's like a little box that's got a little arrow. If you click on that, you're going to be able to see some additional choices that you have. I've set up my default so that it's Times New Roman, regular font, size 12 or point 12. But probably, unless you've already customized it, you're probably going to find that your default setting probably was, what is it? Here we go. Probably was something like this. So let me just pretend that was the one that we had. And in this course, we're going to be using Times New Roman, so what you'll want to do is change it to Times New Roman. Now, you can do this every time that you start a document, and you might need to do that if you're using a computer that needs to have a different default setting. But you may also want to just change the default setting for always, and that way you won't have to remember. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set as default, so I'm going to click on this. And I'm going to say not just for this document, but for all documents used in a normal template. And so now, when I open up a new document, so I'm going to hit New and hit Create. It automatically goes to Times New Roman 12 point. I don't have to do anything. So I can kind of turn my brain off with respect to font. Getting the wrong font, especially at the beginning of the semester, is a really common problem students have, and it is an automatic 1-point deduction. So it's a smart strategy to have, at least to have on your tickler list, hey, make sure you have the right font. Even students who change the font for a document sometimes forget to change the header or the footer font, or they forget to change the font and material that they're cutting and pasting from another document. A good approach to keep in mind when you're dealing with a document in that situation, at the end of it, is to just go ahead over here and select all, and then go back and make sure that you have the font that you want. And that's going to get you the right font. Let's say I decided for some crazy reason I wanted to use Arial. We'll do Arial Narrow. See, it changes every single solitary bit of it. But I hate Arial, so I'm not going to keep that. I'm going to go back to my Times New Roman. That's a way of getting everything set up. So if you somehow or another don't want to set your default setting, be sure to have one of your steps to go to Select and Select All. Okay. Let's also look at the paragraph section. One of the things I like to do when I'm setting up Word for my purposes is to take away a lot of the automatic things that Word will do for you, because I like my documents to be the way I like them to be and not necessarily the way Word likes them to be. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to remove, there would probably be automatically some kind of spacer here after. I don't want there to be any space. If I choose to have an extra space, I want to be the one who controls that. And I'm also going to make this one space. I'm not going to make it 1.15. That's just my preference. So I am going to hit OK. And again, I have now changed the default setting because I clicked on default. I could also change tabs. I don't think there's a need to do that though. So those are two ways that I can set up my document so that I have a greater flexibility with how I'm going to do this. It still allows me, if I want to add a space, but I'm the one who picks. Word doesn't do that for me. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some more ways that we can customize documents. Okay, so let's look for a second at this document. And this, don't worry, you don't need to know this document. This isn't even a document for this course. Let's look at some ways we can format some aspects of it. Here's my type. I'll change that. Let's look at just this paragraph. This paragraph, we can look up here, it is left justified, meaning that there is a nice crisp border on this left side. Let's just look at, and this is probably the most common way to set up a paragraph. Let's look at it if we were to center it. And you can see now, neither the left nor the right side has a crisp edge to it. All the text is going towards the middle. Very rarely would we do this for a paragraph, but it would be commonly done, say, for this area. You can see all this is lovely, nicely centered. Another choice we have is to right justify. Again, we wouldn't do this for a paragraph. There are some times we'll talk about, in fact, later on in the presentation, when you might want to right justify. But that's not a common thing in English. In certain languages, maybe Hebrew, you might right justify all the time, but not for us. A fourth choice is full justification. And that is when both there's a nice crisp edge on the left side and a nice crisp edge on the right side, except for the last line of and if the left line doesn't extend all the way. Some people really like this look. It looks to me, and I think to most people, like a newspaper or a magazine would do, because typically newspapers and magazines are fully justified. As you can see, just compare this paragraph to this paragraph. It actually looks fine here. Let me just do another paragraph so you can see what that might look like as well. Do full justification. And this also looks fine. But let me see if I can play around with something and get something that's a little bit here we go. Okay, so let's say this is, I know this is a super long word, I'm making up the word, it doesn't even exist, but let me fully justify this, just so we can see what that looks like. And you can see what the problem with full justification can be. Look how spread out that sentence is. This is just one space, and look how big it is, whereas ordinarily a space would be this big. So it looks kind of peculiar. Now, of course, we really wouldn't have a word this long, so I'm going to put it back. Now it looks much more normal, but you can see it's still stretched out a little bit. As I said, some people like full justification. Some people don't like it. For this class, we aren't doing full justification, but of course, if your attorney prefers it, then that's what you ought to do. Some attorneys don't have a preference. Some attorneys would want the left justification. Some attorneys would like the full justification. Just be sure that you're following what your attorney prefers. Of course, there may be a local rule in a particular jurisdiction, and you want to follow that about justification. Let's talk about, but for this class, we're doing left justification. Let's talk about the differences between centering and tabbing. Right here, we have centered text. Now, if you submit a document in a .doc or .docx format, I can open it up and I can highlight it and see right away that it is centered. But let's say that you didn't want to center this. Let's say you decided you wanted to tab it to roughly centered. Well, that's it, roughly centered. I can see that it's not centered. I can see over here that it's left justified, so I know that you've tabbed it. Let me just make so we can make this a little bit clearer for folks. Let's go ahead and show the tab signs. Why they're not showing up here. Oops. Tab, 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 tab. Not sure why tab signs aren't showing. Display, tab characters. Well, I'm not sure why it's not showing up. Let me pick another document here, and you can see my tab characters show up here. And so that's why you can easily see where your tabs are. I'm not sure why it's not working here, but ordinarily you would see those little lines here, and I'd be able to perfectly see. The benefit of centering, and of course since I had tabs, it's not going to center nicely, so I'd have to get rid of that. The benefits of centering is that it literally centers it based upon the margins that you have set. Now, of course, if I have funky margins, if I have a margin that's over here, it's not going to be centered. But if I have my margins, have a 1-inch margin on one side, for example, and a 1-inch margin on the other side, then this will be in the middle of the page in terms of left and right. That can look really nice. But there are times we'll talk about where tabbing is a better choice. And so be aware that there are two ways to get items at the approximate center, centering and tabbing. And there are good times to use some and good times to use the other. Okay. Let's look at setting up tabs. You can see up here on our line. Let me go back to my other page where we can see. You can see at this line up here, and by the way to make the ruler show up is by clicking on this little box over here. So there's a little box at the extreme right side of the screen. And you can see under each ½ inch there's a little dash or a little up and down mark. And that tells you where the tabs are. I can move tabs. So let me just move this tab here, and you can see what happened. My tabs got moved. So I can play with tabs wherever I want them to be. Microsoft starts out with these tabs in regular places, and they can make a lot of sense. But there might be reasons why you want to have different tab settings in a particular document. Perhaps you're concerned about getting everything onto one page, and so you might choose to have smaller tabs. Those are some factors. But for this class, for the most part, we'll be using the Microsoft Word tabs, and those are the ones that you ought to be planning on using. Let's talk about some special characters. Okay, so let's say I'm going to type the name of a case. Let's say I'm going to, and by the way, for this course we're not going to do blue booking, but at some point in your career at Collin and in your career as a paralegal, you are going to be putting case names into format. So let's say that you have looked up a case, Smith v. Green, And let's say that case is in 123 Southwest 3rd, 456, and we'll say that is a Texas Supreme Court case from 2010. So this is a lovely blue book form. Well, you may know this if you don't know this already, not a big deal, but you may know that the name of the case has to be in a special format. It can't be, let me just go back here and show you. It can't be in regular format. We're going to need to either italicize it, which would be this little I here, or we're going to need to underline it. Both are correct. Old school people who went to law school or paralegal school back before where processing was as common will probably lean toward underlining. Folks who went to law school maybe after 95 or 2000 will probably tend to italicize. Both are correct. The trend is towards italicizing, mainly because people if someone is reviewing your document on a computer and they see something underlined, many times they will think it's an active link, even if it's not. But if you italicize it, they're not going to think that. Now, I will tell you, I'm old school. I prefer underlining. The reason that I prefer underlining is that it's easier to see. It's more clear that you are saying, hey, I'm putting this in special text. Let me just go ahead and try the italics. Yeah, you can see a difference between Smith v. Green and the rest of the text, but it's not a huge difference. But again, because it is the trend to go towards italics over underlining, for this example, I'm going to use this. Now, one thing that happens with italics is it's harder to tell whether the comma, let me just blow this up so it's bigger font. You would never actually use this font, but just for the purposes of talking about it here, you can see that we have Smith v. Green in italics because you can see the I over here is lit up. But when I do the comma, you can see it's not lit up. Let me show you what an italicized comma looks like. It actually does look different. Look at that. There it is without italics. There it is with. But you know what? If this were normal font size, let me bring it down to a 12, it would be really hard for you to tell whether the comma is italicized or not. And as a result, oops, didn't mean to do that. As a result, people who use italics sometimes don't focus as much on did they italicize the comma or not. Generally, by the way, you don't want to italicize the comma. But if instead of italicizing it, I had underlined it, see right now, it is not italicized right now. I'd underline it. I do want to be careful because look at this. Underline, it's very obvious I don't have the comma underlined. When I underline the comma, it's very obvious it's underlined. So because underlining is a little bit more obvious, it's more important that you're careful and you don't underline periods or commas or other things along those lines. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're working. Again, not so much for this class, but just for general purposes for when you're formatting documents. Okay, I want to show you something else. And again, for this class, this isn't a required feature for you to know, but I think it's a useful thing for you to know about, and that is small caps. So we're again going to go to this font section here, and we're going to click on that box with the arrow pointing down. And when you open this up, you can see lots of cool things that you can do that maybe you weren't aware of. One thing you can do is you can strike through text. That sometimes is useful when you're doing revisions. But the real thing I want to show you is small caps. As I click on small caps, I give you an example of what it looks like. So here it is with just normal writing. You can see the T is capitalized, the I-M-E-S is lowercase. When I do small caps, the T is still capitalized, but the I-M-E-S are smaller in size than the T, but they are also caps. They're small caps. This can be a really sharp look. There are some times in legal writing where you have to use small caps, but you probably won't need to ever use those styles. Those are for scholarly articles, and most legal professionals don't ever write scholarly articles. But having said that, you may find either you may prefer to use it for certain purposes, or you may have a colleague who prefers to use small caps, maybe for headings or for some other purposes. And by the way, it can look really, really nice on a resume. So I wanted to show you that feature. For this class, you never have to use it, but it's just something kind of nice to know about as a feature. Let me pause and talk about the topic of style manuals. large law firms often have a style manual. Sometimes they're even published outside the law firm, but even if they're not published outside the law firm, they're available to legal professionals within the law firm. And that style manual will say things like what font to use, what format letters should be in, what are the various technical aspects of correspondence and other documents. Style manuals are kind of inherently arbitrary in some sense because someone had to make a decision, and reasonable people can differ on a lot of these points. But what the style manual is saying is we get that there's lots of different ways of doing this, but we want all of us to do it the same way, kind of like we're branding ourselves. For example, when you see a swoosh on a product, an athletic product, you know it's Nike. But let's say every Nike product manager had a slightly different swoosh. Well, it wouldn't make kind of a statement than having the same swoosh always gives to the Nike product. And so that's a similar thing with the style manual. That law firm is trying to say, we want to brand ourselves. We want there to be one vision for our law firm so that when Sally produces a document here or when Bob produces a document here, the words are going to be different, obviously, but they're going to look the same, and it's going to look very, very nice. And so that's what a style manual does. And so what happens if you're in a law firm that has a style manual, the vast majority, perhaps all of the legal professionals, will follow it, even if their preference is a little bit different, because they know, hey, you know, this isn't my time to shine individually, it's to play by the rules. Smaller law firms are less likely to have a style manual. So when you go to work for a smaller law firm, you may be in a position where you're not necessarily following a style manual, but it may be a more informal style manual. For example, no, there is no manual, but everybody does it the way Laura does it. Well, then you'll want to talk to Laura, get some examples from Laura so that you can match the style that Laura uses. Or in some offices, there is no one set style, so attorney Mary does it one way, and attorney Susan does it a different way. And so when you're working with Mary, you're going to use this font, and when you're working with Susan, you're going to use that font. So sometimes you have to be kind of flexible and go with the flow from that perspective. For our course, we don't have a published style manual, but I will be telling you every time you have a project or an assignment how we are going to do it in this class. And you may think when I give you this instruction, well, why did she pick that? I'd really prefer this other font, or I'd really prefer not to indent here. Those are quite possibly, your preferences are quite possibly very reasonable and could have easily been the way that a person could go on these issues. But, you know, when we're speaking of a style manual, you got to make a decision, and it's going to be somewhat arbitrary. So you'll find sometimes that I say, oh, you got to do it this way for this class. What I don't mean when I say that is that every legal professional in the United States is going to agree with me this is the only way to do it. There may be a few things that I say that might be true for, but most of the things there's going to be reasonable differences of opinion. For my class, you need to do it the way that I'm suggesting. But when you go to work at a law firm and your attorney says, hey, do it this way, then of course you're going to do it the way he or she prefers. So when I say that this is the way to do it for this class, I'm not saying this is the only acceptable way of doing it. I just need to have one style so that I can fairly grade the work that I receive. You may be thinking, well, if there isn't one right way, what does it matter whether I do it your way or somebody else's way? The way that I pick the style, let me first of all start by explaining kind of how I came up with it. I looked at lots and lots of legal documents. I have about 25 years of legal experience. And so I've seen a lot of legal documents, and I've read a lot about legal documents, and I've looked at a lot of legal documents. And what I tried to do when I came up with the style for this course is come up with something that was something that it would be widely accepted, that is uncontroversial. No one would say, oh, that looks terrible. That is conservative, and that is relatively easy to create. So it's kind of a middle-of-the-road approach. It's not going to offend anybody. There's not going to be people out there that go, oh, that just looks terrible. But as I say, reasonable minds can differ. So I don't want you to leave here thinking, oh, well, this is the only way of doing things. But you may think, well, this presents some problems for me because at work I do it a different way than what I do for this class. And I can see that that can be confusing. But I would suggest to you that in a way that's a good thing, because the more different styles you're exposed to, the more options you have to choose from. And honestly, that reflects a real-world situation. I'll give you kind of a silly example. I used to work in a department where there was an attorney. I will call the attorney Susan. That's not a real name. Anyway, Susan and I shared a secretary. Susan's a lovely woman. I am her friend to this day. But Susan had her quirks. I probably have my quirks too. I just don't know what they are. Anyway, one day I was in the copy room and I saw my secretary working. And I saw she had a protractor and a ruler. And I was kind of intrigued by what she was doing with a protractor and a ruler. And she was stapling things. And so I asked her, just kind of making conversation, what's up? What are you doing? And she said to me with a completely straight face, well, Susan, when I prepare documents for Susan, she wants me to make sure that the staple is at a 45-degree angle and that it's 1/2 inch from the top of the page. And I'm like, but the copy machine will staple it for you. You're familiar with that feature. Obviously she was. And she goes, well, yes, that's true, but the copy machine we use would have done it at not at a 45-degree angle, and it wouldn't be 1/2 inch from the top. And so I manually staple the papers together so that they meet Susan's expectations. Well, I was floored by this. I had never heard of somebody having staple preferences. I'd heard a lot of preferences, but not that one. That legal secretary, though, was very good. When she was doing my work, she used the automatic feature on the copier because that was faster, and that was perfectly fine with me. But when she was doing Susan's work, she adapted and remembered, okay, Susan does it this way, Cindy does it this way. And you're going to find in your practice that's going to come up all the time. You're going to find different quirks, and it may be the attorney, it may be the law firm, it may be the court, because many times local rules or local practice says, for this court we do it this way, for this other court we do it this way. So being flexible about those things can be a really good idea, not just a good idea, but can be required by the local rules. Okay, so let's talk, or we're going to spend most of our time today talking about letter format. Let me first of all go in. Here we go. I'm going to go into the sample documents folder here. And then the sample documents right here. And I'm going to pull up a letterhead. I'm just going to pull up Montaña's letterhead. As a legal professional, you will probably face two kinds of letterheads, or potentially two kinds of letterheads in your experience. One is going to be the more common one, where a well-established law firm will have letterhead that's already printed. Many times it will have multiple colors in it. And so you will actually put the letterhead that's already printed on it in the copy machine, and you won't, of course, retype it because this will already be in here, but you will need to make sure that you reserve space at the top and only start your typing below where the letterhead will be. And very likely you'll have a macro that will help you make sure that you don't start typing over the part of the letterhead. You only use a letterhead for the first page of a letter. Sometimes those smaller firms or new firms won't have letterhead printed. And so what you will have is this template. And so you will, instead of having a page that you put into the printer, you will actually have this that you will type below. And again, you'll just use it on the first page, so you won't put it in a header. You'll just put it at the top of the first page, and then you'll start typing below here. Common things to go on the letterhead are going to be obviously the name of the firm, the physical address of the firm, usually some telephone numbers, some fax numbers. There may also be a website, and then oftentimes the names of the partners. And there may even be direct direct telephone numbers or personal email addresses, things along those lines. And then there may be some graphics, you know, there may be a picture of the outside of the building, or maybe a scales of justice or something like that, and various lines, you know, to kind of make it attractive. All of those things can be aspects of the letterhead. So that gives you an example of what mine might look like. We're not going to play around with the letterhead, and you shouldn't. When if you are given a template with the letterhead, what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, oh, gee whiz, I don't like the way this is set up. I think I'm going to italicize it, or I'm going to change the font. No, this is, you know, probably someone has spent hours and hours and hours, maybe days and days and days, thinking about how the law firm wants to present itself. And so unless you get approval from somebody, you ought to keep that stylistic statement the way that the law firm has decided to present it. Again, this goes back to branding of the law firm. Okay, so we're going to keep the letterhead the same. And that would be true even if this letterhead happens to be in Times New Roman, but if it were in a different font, you wouldn't change the letterhead, even if you were preparing the letter in Times New Roman. Okay. The first thing that you're going to do when you start a letter below the start of it is you're going to put the date. There are let me first talk about the type of letter format that we're going to use. We are going to use, and let me actually write this here, so we are going to use modified block in this course. There will be a test question on this, so remember, we are using modified block. Now, as soon as I use that term, let me tell you, unfortunately, that the term modified block is not precise. So if you were to say Google the term modified block, you will find people who have different rules about their modified block, whether they tab here or whether they don't indent or things along those lines. So don't assume, oh, well, Groover said modified block, so all I have to do is Google modified block, and whatever, you know, turns up on my search, that will be the same thing that Groover's talking about. It might be the same thing, it might not. So the name for it is modified block, but don't assume that everybody's modified block is the same thing. Okay, so let me go back to our letter. So we're going to start with the date. Now, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to tab to the approximate middle of the page and then put the date in. Let's say the date is June 23rd, 2015. We'll want to use, by the way, the standard date. The month goes first, then there's a space, then there's the date without any TH or anything like those, just the number, a comma, a space, and then the year. We would not do the European style. This would not be okay. I suppose if you're writing to a European law firm, that might be okay, but that's not the way we do it in the United States. Nor would it be okay to do the TH, nor is it okay to do 6, 23, 2015. Oops, I made that. That is not okay. You need to write out the date. Now, I said the approximate center. I could have tabbed it. Oops, I'm sorry. I could have tabbed it one more. But that, to me, is the closest to the middle. You don't want to hit the space bar. You see all those little black dots there? That's for me hitting the space bar. You want there only to be these lovely arrows. It takes us to the middle. We'll talk in a few minutes why we want to use the tab button instead of the center button, but just trust me, doing the center button is going to cost you a point, so don't do that for our letters. Now let's talk about adding the mailing instructions. The general rule is that you ought to include mailing, your method of mailing, unless you are sending it first class U.S. mail. So if you don't list it, the assumption that the reader can make safely is that you are sending it U.S. mail. For this class, I'm going to ask that you always put the mailing, so there's no issue one way or the other. So if I were sending it, say, via UPS overnight delivery. That might be something that I would say. But I don't keep it here on the left margin. Remember I said we almost always put things for left justified, but for this particular item, we're going to right justify it. I think that's the only thing I do right justification on. And usually I'm going to either italicize it or I'm going to underline it. Whatever you prefer. I'm going to italicize it in this case. Another thing that I might do is I might do a tracking number. This can be handy so that if there becomes an issue about whether the letter actually arrived where it was supposed to, you don't have to look for a tracking form. You can actually look at the letter to figure out the number. But it's not a requirement. If I were sending this by facsimile, we're not going to do this in this course, but I would probably put the telephone number, and then I would say something like 4 pages total or something like that. But I'm going to go back to UPS overnight delivery. The important thing to remember here is that we're going to right justify. Now I am ready for, I'm going to go back to left justification. I'm going to get rid of the italics. Now we're ready for the inside address. The inside address is the term that we use for the address of the recipient. It is inside the letter, right? That's what we're talking about. Sometimes people will use the inside address as a way to print a label that will go on the outside of the envelope. You certainly can do that. However, the post office rules or the post office preferences as to how that address ought to appear so it puts your envelope in the best chance of arriving at its recipient is not the same as the rules that we would want to use for an inside address. It might work well for a character reader at the post office to read, but it doesn't look attractive to our eyes. So keep that in mind. Okay, so we're going to start. Well, we have to write the name of the person. Let's say we want to send it to Robert Smith. Okay, and this is a very common issue that comes up. That might be the way that you write it. But it's not the way that we want to do it for this course. We want to always start with some kind of title. In this case, we'd most likely use Mr. Robert Smith. If Mr. Smith has a PhD or a MD or a DO or he's a dentist, DDS, we would make that Dr. Robert Smith. But let's say this is Roberta Smith and she isn't a doctor. And so now we have a choice to make. We are going to go with MS. We would not use Miss or Mrs. unless we knew that Roberta preferred those terms. In a professional environment, and most likely if we're sending a legal a letter from our law firm to Roberta, we're sending it to her in a business-type context. She will most likely want to be referred to as Ms., whatever her particular marital status might be. Because after all, her marital status has nothing to do with the completion of her job responsibilities. Now, there's always occasions where somebody really prefers Miss or Mrs. Perhaps the person is of a different generation, maybe a more mature person who grew up in an era where Mrs. was commonly used by women. Or perhaps this is a newly married person who's excited about being married and she's enjoying being called Mrs. something. Mrs. Roberta Smith in this case. But again, unless you know that that person really prefers Miss or Mrs., we ought to go with Ms., M-S period. Now, if you decide to, or you have some reason to think this person prefers Mrs., then you have another issue to confront, and that is, let's say Roberta is married to David. Well, if she's married to David, then she could go by Mrs. David Smith, and that literally means the wife of David Smith. Or she could go by her first name, Roberta Smith, Mrs. Roberta Smith. If Mrs. Smith is widowed, she can still go by Mrs. Roberta Smith or the name of her late husband, Mrs. David Smith. If she's divorced from David Smith, then she can still go by Mrs. Roberta Smith even though she is no longer married. She cannot, however, go by Mrs. David Smith. The most common time nowadays where you'll find people choosing to go by Mrs. David Smith would be when you're saying Mr. and Mrs. David Smith, because obviously it's more challenging to say Mr. David and Mrs. Roberta Smith. So this is the most common way that you end up using the David and not Roberta's first name. But if you're sending it just to Roberta and you happen to know Roberta prefers Mrs., I would probably still go with Roberta unless we happen to know that she prefers the David instead of Roberta. You're going to offend very, very few people using Ms., and so it's a go-to decision to make. And so that'll be my recommendation unless you have a strong reason to think otherwise. The next line is going to be so I'm going to get rid of the Mrs. here since we've decided we're not going to use that. The next is, oh, by the way, the one time that you wouldn't use another title that you might use is honorable. If Roberta were a judge. The one time that you might not use Mr. or Ms. would be if we had a name that we just don't know if this person is a male or a female. And so we might say Christian Smith because we don't know whether it's Mr. Christian Smith or Ms. Christian Smith. But in other situations, we ought to specify. And we'll say this is a woman. If we are writing to her in her capacity as an employee of some organization, we're going to want to use her title. Let's say her title is Human Resources Manager. We will add that, and then we'll add the name of the company, ABC Corporation Incorporated. We'll say that's the name of it. Of course, if we're writing to her because she wants us to help her with her will or assist her with her child custody dispute, we certainly wouldn't send it to her in a capacity as Human Resources Manager. That might be her title at work, but that has nothing to do with the fact that she needs assistance with her child custody situation. So we'd only use the title in her employer if we're writing to her because of her role as Human Resources Manager at this place of employment. And then, of course, we'd include the address. We'll say it's Main Street, Suite A, Allen, Texas, 77002, something along those lines. You notice that we have all of this on the hard left margin. All that's lining up there. Okay, now we're ready for the Ray line or the subject line. We're going to, and you may have noticed here that I have a paragraph sign or a space between each one of these sections. You can have more than one space, and there are probably times where you're trying to get a whole letter onto one page and it's a tight fit that you might actually, get rid of a space so you can get it nicely on one page. But ideally, you'll want to have one space between all these sections. So here we are. We're on the Ray line. We're going to tab this in, and I'm going to do Ray, and then I'm going to type what the letter is about. In this context, Ray means, well, some people say it means the word Ray in Latin. Here we go. Let's flip over here. The word, in the nominative case, race in Latin means thing. But when you decline it, one of the when you say in re, you'll see this in legal matters fairly commonly. That means about the thing. And when we say the word thing here, we don't mean something that you can touch, but the topic. So re in this context means kind of the same thing as topic. So sometimes when people see re, that's what they are thinking re means. Sometimes people say, well, no, re means reference. This is what the letter is referring to. Whichever meaning helps you is fine, but you would write it either way, the re and then a colon. The re line can actually be up to 3 lines, and probably even 4 lines could be possible. Here are some things that you're likely to want in your re line. For one thing, you're going to want, let me explain to you the purpose of the re line. The re line really has 2 audiences. The first audience is you or someone in your office who's responsible for filing this letter. It might be you, might be someone else. So you want the information on the re line to make it very easy for that filer to get it in the right file in the right place so you can find it later on. So your goal is to give that person information that's going to help them be successful and to be efficient about doing it. You're also writing it so that Ms. Smith here can, well, ideally file it for herself, but also know what the heck this letter is about, to kind of prepare her for the content so she'll know what to do with the information. Is this an urgent matter? Is this something she can think about later on? So really, there are 2 audiences with this. And as a result of the fact that there are 2 audiences, sometimes you're going to have a variety of things here. On the first line, I like to give a summary of what I'm writing about. So maybe this is about scheduling your deposition. And then on this next line, I'm going to actually tab this so it nicely lines up. I might say what the case is about. Maybe it's Smith versus Harris. Maybe civil, and we'll say that the case number is here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we have a case number. This is, of course, the case number from the court. Then I might list, oops, here we go, I might list our particular file. And let's say Ms. Smith is our client, so maybe this is the way we identify our client. And this is the 5th matter we've done first. So this tells the filing clerk, okay, it goes in the SMI file number 5. Okay, so this kind of sets up. Sometimes people will put this in bold or italics. I don't have a position on that. You can do that if you want, or you can leave this just the way it is. We'll have but it is important that it be indented. And if you have more than 1 line, it's important that it line up. That's the wonderful thing about tabbing, is that you can get this nice, crisp line here. If I had instead spaced it, let me just show you an example here. I'm never going to get it to line up just perfectly, because unlike the old days when people used typewriters, it used to be in the olden days when I learned to type that whenever you struck a key, a typewriter moved a discrete distance every single time, whether it was a skinny L or a fat W, it was going to move the same amount. And so a space was the same whether you hit the space bar or whether you hit a skinny L or a fat W. But that's not true anymore. With the smart computers we have, we can see that a fat W, let me just show you an example of this thing. I'm going to blow up. I'll go back to this side here. Let me just show you. If I do a fat capital W and a skinny I, let me just do a series. Lots of W's. Let me do 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10. Now I'm going to do 5 I's. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can see a fat W takes up a lot more space than a skinny I. And if I were to do 10 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's about the same as an I. So you can see how you can't really use the space bar the way that you can in order to line things up as a tab, because the tab we'll make sure every tab is situated here below the one above it, so you have this nice crisp edge. Okay, so that's how the ray line works. Now let's talk about the salutation. That's the next section. You're going to always start with dear. Then you're going to include, in most cases, some form of a title, and then the surname, and then you're going to use a colon. A couple of things to keep in mind. In this case, it's really easy. We're going to take the MS from here and put it here, Ms., and then we're going to take the Smith. We aren't going to include her name, Christian. Let's just change her name to, we'll change it to Betty. We're not going to use Betty. We're going to use her title and her surname, and then we're going to use a colon here. This is a really common mistake that people make. Most of the time, most of us are sending, when we write a letter, we're sending personal correspondence. And when we send personal correspondence, we use a comma. That's appropriate. That's correct. So if I were sending Betty my annual Christmas letter saying, hey, Betty, this is what we did this year, you know, doing this and that thing, then I would use a comma because commas are appropriate for personal correspondence. For business letters, we use a colon, a dot on top of a dot. Not a semicolon, but a colon. So be sure to use that. That will count off a point if you put a comma in one of our correspondence. Okay. Now again, let's say, we'll go back to the example of, let's say all we know is this is Pat Smith, and we don't know if Pat is Patricia or Patrick. In that time, we probably would say, Dear Pat Smith, because we don't want to offend him or her by using the wrong gender. But unless you're in that situation, unless you don't know the gender, you would instead use the title. And let's say we happen to know that this is Patricia Smith, so we're going to say, Dear Ms. Smith. It would be incorrect to say, not incorrect, but it would be awkward to say, Dear Ms. Pat Smith. There's no need for the Pat in that. It sounds awkward, and so please don't do that. Sometimes people want to use a first name here, and they want to say, Dear Pat. That isn't wrong, but for our class, we're going to take a conservative approach. We're going to assume that we don't know Pat. And maybe if we were having a conversation with her, we would be using her first name. But in a letter, it's a little bit more of a formal mechanism. And so it's a tad presumptuous to call somebody whom we don't know by his or her first name. So it's a better course of action to use the Dear Miss Smith. So you should assume in our letters that we don't know this person well at all, or maybe at all, and we'll be using the Miss Smith. One thing about letter formatting that I think is helpful to keep in mind is that you're almost never going to offend somebody by extending them more courtesy and by being more formal. They may think it's a little old-fashioned, they may think it's unnecessary, but they're not going to be offended. If you start calling Pat Pat when she feels that she doesn't know you well enough and that it's presumptuous, you might offend her. And so the safer course of action is to take the more conservative approach. Another reason it can be a good idea to use a more conservative approach is that, let's say you're sending a letter and you're giving Pat some bad news. You're telling her that you lost the motion, or you're warning her that some action she took is not going to be good for her in the long run. In those circumstances, it's usually a good idea to make a more formal presentation. It takes a little bit of the sting out of it to be hearing it in a formal context than in a more familiar approach. So those are two good reasons to use the more formal approach. For this class, you'll be using it, but I certainly understand that different law firms have different procedures in this area. And of course, if you know Pat very well, it might be a little silly to say, Dear Ms. Smith, but I wanted to alert you to that. Okay, so now we're ready for the body of the letter. Of course, the body of the letter is the most important part. It's where you say to Pat whatever it is you intended to say, the purpose of the letter. But right now we're talking about formatting. We're not really talking about content. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tab. And this tab will be the same tab that we did for Ray. So the R, capital R in Ray will line up with the first word in the body of our paragraph. And I'm just going to say, we'll just come up with a little bit of text. Let's see, thank you for speaking with me this morning about your deposition. As you know, I have spoken with opposing counsel, and he has agreed to schedule it for July 9 at 10 a.m. in his office. Okay, so I have now 2 sentences in this paragraph. While it's common to have more than 2 sentences, as long as you have 2 sentences, you're okay. Generally, you won't want to have paragraphs of only 1 sentence. In fact, if you do, you'll lose a point in this course. All of your letters need to have at least 2 paragraphs. They can have more, but they need at least 2. So now we're ready for our second paragraph. Notice that we indent this one again, so it's going to be lining up right below the T in thank you and the R in Ray. We're also going to have a space between. So let's say in this space, if you have any questions, please contact me at Now, I said that every paragraph needs to have at least 2 sentences, but there's an exception to it. Your final paragraph doesn't have to. It can have more than 1 sentence, but it oftentimes is just a, if you have any questions, please call, or thank you for your attention, or something very brief. And so it's fine under those circumstances to have it be just 1 sentence. But your paragraphs above that need to have more than 1 sentence in it. So now we have written the body of our document. So we're going to go to the next line. We're going to again add that space, and now we're ready for the closing. There are several closings that are acceptable. The 2 probably most common are going to be very truly yours is a common one. Another one that is also acceptable is sincerely. You can see here that this is lining up perfectly with a J. And that's what we want. Again, think about this line. You can see from the 3-inch mark all the way down to the J in June, down to the V and very truly, or if we chose the S in sincerely. Obviously, you'd only use one of these. I'm going to get rid of the sincerely and use very truly yours. That's what my first firm used, so it's just what I use. A pointer about very truly yours is it doesn't go in quotes, and you only capitalize the first letter. So you don't capitalize the T, you don't capitalize the yours. You would end this with a comma. You don't put a colon here. So even though you may have thought, well, we put a comma here, we put a comma here, we put a colon here, we still keep a comma here. Okay? Things like call me or best or things like that are more informal than we want to go. For the purposes of this class, use very truly yours as your closing. It's safe, it's not going to offend anybody, and it is appropriate level of formality. Once you have done that, you're going to want to have at least 3, I'm going to do 3 here, 3 or 4 returns here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 3 returns. If you have somebody who's going to sign this letter who has an unusually big signature, you may even want to have 4. If you're squeezing to get it all on one page, you can have it as few as 2. Okay, but you definitely need to have space. Occasionally I'll see somebody who will put, let's say the person who's going to sign this letter is Rachel Harris. Well, let's have it, Rachel Howard. Well, there's no way Rachel can sign the letter in this space, so that's going to result in a point deduction, so don't do that. In this case, we're going to put Rachel's name down here, Rachel Howard. Okay, now if Rachel is an attorney, then this is perfect. We don't need to have anything under her name. If, though, she is a paralegal or a legal secretary or some other position, we need to put her title below here, whatever that title might be. The reason that we need that is whenever you have a law firm letterhead, if the signer of the letter has no title underneath her name, the assumption is that Rachel is an attorney. And so Rachel, if she isn't an attorney, has perhaps misrepresented herself to Pat Smith as an attorney, and that could be evidence of the unauthorized practice of law. So it is really important, if Rachel is completing this on letterhead, to make sure her title is clear in the letter. It might be Rachel, a paralegal, it might be paralegal to Emma Brown, the attorney. Or say, well actually, let's say Dan Marino. Daniel Marino. Okay? Okay, so we now have the letter. Now, sometimes people want to put a period or a comma here. That is not necessary. In fact, it is not good. You should not do that. The only time that you would put a comma here is if you decided to put Rachel's title on the same line. But that doesn't look good. So again, I suppose if you were really struggling to get it on one page, you could do that, but that is definitely not a best practice, and please don't do that for this course. So when you have the title on a separate line, you don't put a comma or a period there. Okay. Let's talk about typist initials. Let's say that I am not, I'm going to move my margin back here. I am not Rachel. I am a secretary and I have typed this letter for Rachel. Well, what I will do, let's say Rachel's name is Rachel A. Howard. I'm going to, in capital letters, write R-A-H slash, and then my initials. My initials happen to be Cynthia Gruber, so CG. So I put her initials in caps first. I do a backslash, and I put my initials in lowercase second. What this tells the recipient of the letter, Ms. Smith in this case, is that this letter was prepared for Rachel A. Howard, but I mean she could have already seen that because it's right here. But that CG, and Ms. Smith may not know who CG is, but I can eventually be tracked down, actually typed the letter. Now you may wonder, well, who cares who typed the letter? Well, the reason that it can be important, and I'm going to go back to the time before word processing, is that once upon a time, to type a letter was a fairly detail. It still is detail-oriented, but it was a more detail-oriented process because, you know, if you had one typo, if you somehow or another typed an E in Howard instead of an O, you might have to start the whole letter again because it was very difficult to correct the type. Yes, there was liquid paper and there were some ways of correcting it, but it was hard to make it look good. And certainly in a law firm, many law firms had a policy that no, you couldn't, if there was a typo, you had to restart the letter. And so if the letter went out with a typo, a law firm for quality control purposes would want to know, well, who actually typed the letter? And of course, Rachel is also responsible for making sure that she has letters that she proofs them carefully. But that is a little bit of history of why it's important to have those initials. Nowadays, it may be important because of where that document is stored. So since I created the letter, presumably I know what file I've put this in. And so I might be in a better position to find the letter in electronic format than Rachel might be. Now, but let's say Rachel actually typed this letter herself. Well, she does not have to do this. She does not have to indicate that she typed it. In fact, if there are no typist initials, the assumption is that she typed it herself. And in fact, that's how most letters go out these days. Even attorneys for the most part, type their own letters. They may type it up and then ask their legal secretary to clean it up, to format it, to make sure there aren't any typos in it. But most people compose at the keyboard now, so typist initials aren't as common as they once were. Let's talk about some other things that might go at the bottom of the letter. One thing that might go in the bottom of the letter is enclosures. And it can be the whole word typed or just an abbreviation. An enclosure is something that is included in the envelope with the letter. It may be a receipt or a bill. It may be a document of some other type. The reason that you put it down here in this position is to alert the reader, Ms. Smith, so when she opens the envelope, she doesn't miss the attachment. Or when she's looking at the letter, she can go through the envelope and say, oh, wait a second, the attachment was missing, or the enclosure was missing. And so now she knows to contact Rachel A. Howard saying, hey, Rachel, I got your letter, but the enclosure wasn't there. Can you send me the enclosure? So it's kind of a quality control aspect. And again, sometimes when people have enclosures, they might even list what the enclosure is. Receipt for services rendered, whatever the item might be. But sometimes it just says enclosure or enclosures. Obviously, if there's more than one, you would say enclosures. It is true that if you reference the enclosure in the body of the letter, you don't have to list it down here. Let's say you had another paragraph and you said, I am enclosing our firm's May bill to ABC Corporation for legal services rendered. I would appreciate it if you would put this bill in line to be paid, or something along those lines. Again, I need to have the two sentences here. Since I'm saying here, I am enclosing our bill, I technically don't have to say enclosure. But again, I think it's helpful to, I think a best practice is to, even when you reference in the letter, to go ahead and put it here. As a best practice. Sometimes instead of using the word enclosure, the person will write attachment or attachments. An attachment typically means that it is actually stapled to the document. It is physically attached or maybe paper clipped, whereas an enclosure is not actually physically connected to the letter. That's the usual distinction between that. We're used to attachments a lot because of email, and so we attach something when we are sending an email. So it may be that some people start using the term attachment for letters through snail mail because they're so used to the term for email, and so the distinction might be getting lost. But I wouldn't worry too much about whether you're saying attachment or enclosure. But the important thing is that you're noting that you are including something in it. Let's talk about some other things that might go here. So I'm going to go back to enclosure. Since I say I am enclosing as opposed to I am attaching, I'm going to say enclosure here just so I'm consistent. Another thing that we might have in a letter are CCs. So I'm going to do CC, colon, and then let's say I'm going to send this, I'm sending this letter to Ms. Pat Smith, but I'm also giving a copy to Mr. James Franklin. Okay, first of all, a best practice in my opinion that looks better is to have both of them lowercase. You will find people who like them uppercase or who like the first one uppercase and the second one lowercase. But the more traditional, the more typical pattern is to have CC, then a colon, then a space. You will find people who don't put the title, so they'll just say CC James Franklin. A best practice, in my opinion, is to go ahead and say Mr. James Franklin, because after all, we're using Ms. up here and we're using Ms. here. So since we're extending that courtesy to Ms. Smith, it seems weird not to extend that courtesy to Mr. Franklin as well. It's just kind of a matter of consistency, and again, err on the side of being more formal. A couple of things to keep in mind about the CC. The first thing is, what does CC mean? There are two common stories about what it means. The first is kind of an historical thing. Again, before word processing existed, when documents were typed and before copy machines were readily available, when a typist would type a letter, she would have carbon copy. She would actually have several pages stacked that she would actually type on at one time, and between each one of the pages she would have carbon paper. And the top copy of the letter would be the one that is actually being hit by the key of the typewriter, and the lower pages of the letter, the copies of the letter would actually be getting the ink from the carbon paper. And as you go farther down that stack of papers, each copy would be a little bit more muddy than the one before it. So if you had, say, 10, the bottom one, the 10th copy, would probably be, it would be legible, but it wouldn't be nearly as attractive as the top copy. And so the CC would mean carbon copy. And of course, Miss Smith would get the original, the one that was on top. And Mr. Franklin would be getting that first copy. Now, of course, no one uses carbon copy anymore. No one uses typewriters anymore. But that is a term that kind of has continued. You'll find some people actually drop the first C and just do C. For this class, we're going to use both Cs. So some people say, well, you know, carbon copy is such an old-fashioned term, and they've invented another term for it, which is courtesy copy. That we're sending Mr. Franklin a courtesy copy. So if that's easier for you to remember, that's fine. But at the end of the day, you really don't need a name for it. Just remember that it's CC. The second name, let's say I want to send it to, oops, here we go. Move it here. So I'm going to send it to Ms. Vera York. Now, since I'm having a second name here, I'm going to want the M in, oops, I'm going to want the M in Mr. to line up with the M in Ms. below. So it's this nice ordering here. There are two ways to order CC names. One is alphabetically. I think that's usually the best path. Another is kind of by order of importance. Sometimes it's obvious. For example, let's say you were sending a letter and you were CCing the President of the United States. Well, obviously he's probably more important than let's say that the second person you're CCing is your next door neighbor. But sometimes it's clear who's more important, and so you're probably not going to result in hurt feelings. But sometimes it's not obvious who's more important, and so if you put one name above another, you might hurt feelings. So alphabetical is kind of democratic in some sense. It probably makes sense to have some idea as to why you're putting them in the order that you are, and that can be a good way of approaching that issue. So we have our CCs. Let's talk for a second about who is seeing what. Miss Smith can see, obviously, that she's getting the letter, and she can see that Mr. Franklin is getting a copy of the letter, and Miss York is getting a copy of the letter. Mr. Franklin can see that the letter is to Miss Smith, so obviously she's getting a copy. He can also see that Miss York is getting a copy. Similarly, Miss York sees, obviously, that Miss Smith is getting a copy, and that Mr. Franklin is getting a copy. So all three of these people know about each other. But let's talk about a circumstance where you, meaning we'll say you're Rachel, you want to send a copy of this to somebody, and you don't want one of these people, or maybe all these people, to know about the fact that that person is getting it. Well, that's when you use a BCC. And the B in this case stands for blind carbon copy or blind courtesy copy. And of course, we're not using this term to refer to disabled people. We're using this term to refer to the fact that it's blind in the sense that some people are blind to the fact that that person is getting a copy. So the blind carbon copy, we'll say, is going to Ms. Jan Peters. Okay. And of course, even though these aren't going to be on the same page, it's probably a good idea to line them up. So you'd want to tab this as well. So in this situation, now that we have a BCC, Ms. Smith is going to know about Mr. Franklin and Ms. York, but she's not going to know that Ms. Peters is getting a copy of the letter. Similarly, Mr. Franklin knows about Ms. Smith and Ms. York, but he doesn't know about Ms. Peters. And Ms. York knows about Mr. Franklin and Ms. Smith, but she doesn't know about Ms. Peters. Ms. Peters, however, knows all. She knows Ms. Smith is getting a copy of the letter. She knows Mr. Franklin is getting a copy of the letter. She knows Ms. York is getting a copy of the letter. She knows all. So you may be thinking, well, when do I use CC and when do I use BCC? This is a complex question in one kind of more of office politics than document formatting. The help I can provide to you is giving you some ideas about when you might. And of course, the CC and BCC tools are also available within email, and so you'll be confronting this both when you're doing snail mail as well as when you're doing email. Common people to BCC would be the client. Let's say Ms. Smith were not the client and you were corresponding with opposing counsel. Then you might choose to BCC your client. After all, it's really not opposing counsel's business to know what you're sending to the client. Although you might want to include her in the CC. You could go either way on that. There might be times where you're sending correspondence and you want your expert witness to be aware of some of this communication, but you don't necessarily want the other people to know you're sending it to the expert witness. That would be a circumstance wherein you would want to put that in a BCC. Another time that you might use a BCC is if you want your supervisor or the assigned attorney to be on the correspondence. This is especially true for emails. Let me give you an example from my time at Penny's, and this is how it can be used strategically. I was an employment attorney for Penny's for many years, and I would routinely give advice to HR managers. They might call me up and say, we're confronted with this situation, what should we do? And I would give advice, and sometimes the client, most of the time, vast majority of the time, the client would say, thanks, that's wonderful, that's what we'll do. But every now and again, the client would say, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't agree with your decision. And sometimes I would say, well, okay, I've explained to you the risks, the benefits, and the downsides, and it's ultimately your business decision. But there might be other times that I felt it was a legal compliance issue, that the choice that this person was mentioning was not a lawful choice. Didn't happen often, but every now and again it happened. And so at that time I would have to say, well, no, you don't have a choice. You need to, I'd say it nicer than that, but that would be the gist of it. This is what you need to do. But maybe I wasn't sure that they were actually going to do what I was insisting upon. Or I wanted to escalate the matter, but I didn't want to burn bridges. I didn't want to offend them. I didn't want to cause unnecessary tension in the relationship. So one way I might approach that is by BCCing my boss. So my boss knew. So my boss was in a position to tell me, oh, Cindy, you don't have to worry so much about that. I don't think it's really a compliance issue. Oh, okay, maybe I don't have to worry about it. Or maybe my boss will say, yes, you're right. Boy, this is a big concern. You need to make sure that they do this. So you need to follow up. Oh, okay, then that's what I'll do. Now, if I had CC'd my boss, that would be obvious to the person I was sending the email to. And maybe that might kind of tick off that person. Wait a second. Cindy is pulling rank on me by bringing in this higher manager into the equation. And so that might cause her to kind of get her hackles up a little bit, or it might cause her to say, well, if Cindy's bringing in her manager, maybe I need to bring in my manager. And so suddenly we're escalating the situation up several manager levels. And that can cause tensions. And usually, most of the time, you want to have good and comfortable working relationships. So you wouldn't want to do that routinely. I might BCC my boss for another reason. I might be thinking to myself, this manager isn't doing what I think he or she ought to, and he or she knows that I'm not agreeing. And so it's very likely that that manager is communicating with his boss or her boss. Maybe he or she's even BCCing the boss. And what I don't want to do is have that boss, let's say that boss agrees with this HR manager and doesn't think I'm giving good advice. I don't want that the HR manager's boss to go to my boss and blindside my boss. And maybe the manager might only tell part of the story to my boss, and my boss might say, oh, that's perfectly fine. But he only knows part of the story. He doesn't know why I had the view that I did about the situation. So if I BCC my boss, he's going to know, he's going to be prepared for that question, and he won't be blindsided. He won't be put in an awkward position, at least not as awkward a position. So it can be kind of for FYI purposes. Now those are some examples of times you might BCC. It's not a complete or exhaustive list. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there as some situations that you might want to use it. Let me talk about the issue of whether you put BCCs on the same page or a different page. You can put it on the same page. The challenge with that is that it means you're going to have to print out the letter twice. You're going to have to print it one time with the BCs, and then you're going to have to cut it out and print it one time without the BCCs. Because obviously if you print it out with the BCCs, well then obviously it's not really a BCC because Franklin and York and Smith will be able to see that Peters is on the letter. And then you have to say, well, which version am I going to save in the computer? So it does involve a bit more work. So I think the easier path, and the one that I would recommend, is putting the BCC on a separate page. And even if you're not near the bottom of the page, just starting another page, and then you can print out the whole letter, but you'd only send the first page to Smith, Franklin, and York, and you would send Peters both copies of the page. So we've gone through the aspects of a letter. We've talked about the things that make the letter a modified block format. Please refer to this part of the lecture when you are preparing letters and you can't remember, do I indent here? Do I space here? What do I line up? How does that work? What do I right justify? What do I left justify? This is a good cheat sheet for you. Let me remind you that some of the examples you will see in the sample documents file are not compliant with this. And again, that's intentional because in your career you're going to have to use lots of different formats. Some of them are going to not be perfect and you're going to have to adjust them to meet your needs. And so in this example I've done it exactly the way you need to, but don't assume that the examples in the example folder are going to be right. They may do something crazy like this, right? And call that modified block. Yeah, that's actually quite common, but that's not our format. This is our format. So even if a sample in the sample file shows no indentation, I'm still going to count off. Remember, this is your style manual for the purposes of this class. Okay, so we've talked about letters. Now we're going to talk about here we go. Now we're going to talk about captions. Let me see here. Let me go ahead and pull one up. I'm going to type in this is an example of a pleading in federal court that was filed in the Eastern District of Texas, which is the district that Collin County is in. So this is an example. It's not taking a position on the quality of the writing, but the formatting of this document is exactly the way that is routinely done in federal court in Texas. I will tell you, and what we're going to be focusing on is this part down here. Everything below this we're not going to be talking about today. But this is a very typical formatting for both state and federal court in Texas. You will find, though, in other parts of the country it can look quite different. And in fact, some of the examples that you'll see in the sample docs file look very different. But everything we're going to be filing in this case is going to be filed in Texas. So use this type of format as your rule of thumb. And if you see an example document that's set up differently, recognize that that's not the way we do it here. So let's talk about the parts. And we're actually going to create something like this. The first part tells us where the court is. Now, if we were in state court, some of this information would be over here on the right side, but we're going to work on the federal court document here. You can see it's bold, and you can see it's all caps. And you can also see it's centered. Usually there will be 3 lines. One will always say, if we're in federal court, in the United States District Court. The next one will say the particular district we're talking about. We have been talking about the Eastern District of Texas. Just so you'll know, in Texas, federal courts, we have 4 districts, the 4 points on the compass, north, south, east, west. I don't think any state has more than 4, but many states have just 1 or 2 or 3. California, believe it or not, only has 3, so that's kind of interesting that we have more than California, which of course is more populated than we are. This last line doesn't exist in every place. When you have more than one division within a district, you're going to want to list which division it's in. And this, of course, refers to the town. Sherman is the division that this particular matter was filed in. And so you have 3 lines in this case. But as I said, certain district courts only have the 1 division, so you don't list it there. Okay, so that tells you how this is set up. So again, I'm just going to type one up here. So we're going to start with, let me go ahead and let me just get a brand new one here. New, create. So I'm going to center. I'm going to bold. I'm going to put cap locks on. Okay, in the United States District Court. I'm going to flip back here. I'm going to go for the Eastern District of Texas. Next line, for the Eastern District of Texas. And we're going to go with that Sherman division. Okay, so we have done the same look. What we wouldn't want to do here is we wouldn't want to left justify, and tab it over, because that won't be in the exact middle. It won't look as good. We want these to be centered. So that's what we're going to do, center them. Okay. So what's our next section here? Our next section is what we're going to call the style of the case, this section right here. And you can see in this case, Mr. Jackson, he's the plaintiff. He's suing Frisco Independent School District, which is the defendant. Okay, we're not going to use these particular names, but that's how we're going to set up. You can see the name of the plaintiff is all caps. The name of the defendant is all caps. The title that he has in the litigation starts with a capital letter, but the rest of the letters are lowercase. The same is true for defendant. They're not always called plaintiff and defendant. They can have other names, but whatever those names are, respondent, petitioner, there are other names they can have. Those are going to be in the same pattern. We're going to put a comma after the parties, and we're going to indent the title that the party has in the lawsuit. When it's the first party, who's usually going to be a plaintiff, but again, it can be other things, we're going to use a comma. When we've gotten to our final party, we're going to put a period, like this is a sentence in some respect. And then the last thing is we're going to do a V here. We're going to do a lowercase v with a period, not capital, and we're also not going to do VS as in versus, just lowercase v period. So let me just come up with an example that we might do. So I'm going to say, Mary Harris, tab, space, or let's do a comma here, space, and then we're going to put plaintiff, comma, space, then a lowercase v with a period, return, and then we'll say she's suing Joyce Green, comma, return, cap lock, tab, capital defendant, period. Now you're going to want to have spaces. This is somewhat of a cosmetic issue, but usually you're going to want to have a space. Now, of course, if you have lots of parties, you may find that you don't want to have this many spaces because you're not going to be able to get your whole style on one page. So there's some judgment involved here, but as an ordinary rule, you're going to want to have a space. And you can see here, clearly there's a space between Jackson and plaintiff. There's a space between plaintiff and V, space between V and Frisco, and a space between district and defendant. You can see, though, you want your party's name not to have a space. So let's say she had a very long name. Let's say her name was, we'll include her middle name, and let's say she has a hyphenated Higginbotham. Well, as you can see, we're more toward the middle of the page, so what we're probably going to do is return it like that. And so we have her whole name, but we're not going to want to double space that, because that looks like we're talking about two separate people. But let's just keep her name simple. We don't have to worry about that. So we'll go back to Joyce Green. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put in these section symbols. That's the most common way to separate the style of the case from the case number in Texas courts, be it federal court or state court. You will find that in some jurisdictions, courts will separate it not with the section sign, but with this sign. The close parenthesis sign. And so what that person would do is tab it over and tab it over like this. But again, we're not going to use this sign in this case because, again, the section sign is more similar. And this is a good time to talk about special characters. I'm going to show you how to access special characters on my version of Word. There can be different paths to it depending upon the version of Word that you have. But you can always Google it, and you can always, hit the help button to find what you need. But let me show you how to do it with mine. I'm going to go over here to Insert, click on that. Then I'm going to go over to the right and click on Symbol. It's going to give me some default choices. These are keys that special characters I routinely use, and you can see one of my most common characters to use is this section sign. But if you haven't ever used a section sign, it won't be here because you haven't used it. So what you'll need to do then is click on More Symbols. And you'll see there's a whole list of symbols you can do. And what you would do is you literally kind of go through until you found the section symbol. It wasn't too hard to find, so I'm going to click on that. Then I'm going to press Insert. And then I'm going to close. And there it is. Now once I've used it, it's going to be right at the top here, so I can use it again and again. So let me show you how I did that from the start. Let's pretend that I hadn't done this before. I'm ready to do a section symbol. And I'm probably going to be here to begin with. I'm probably on the Home key. I want to add a section symbol. I'm going to hit Insert. I'm going to go to Symbol. If I've used it recently, it will be here. If not, I'm going to hit More Symbols and find it. Click right here. I'm going to hit Insert. Then I'm going to hit Close, and it will show up there. What you don't want to do with this is, here we go. Sorry. You don't want to space this over. Let me just show you what would happen if you tried to space this over. I don't know if you'll be able to see, but it's not going to be perfectly lined up. Let me make it bigger so you can see how it's going to end up being not so good. Maybe not do that big. Here, let's do 18. You can see how it starts getting out of alignment. So you always want to use the tab to get it lined up. Another thing you don't want to use is you don't want to use the center key, because you're going to center everything, right? So now we don't have that nice, crisp line here. And so you're going to have to use the tab to do this. And you're going to want the tab to be approximately the middle of the page. I may not have done that great of a job getting in the middle. You could always change your tabs. And if you decide, oh, I'd like it to be a little bit over here, well, you can certainly do that. There's no reason in the world why you're stuck. There you go. See, obviously you'd want to line them all up, but you could do that. No problem at all. I'm just going to go back to the tabs I had before just because it's easier. It's not a big deal if they're not perfectly lined up. You want to have it approximate. If it's wildly off, that's going to look weird. But generally, you don't have to have it very precise. So we have this lovely margin. Let's look at what else we had in the style. Now we're going to have the case number. As I said, for in state court, we're going to have information over here about the court. We won't have it up here. We'll have it here. But we're going to have our civil action number because this is a civil case. So let's assume our case here is civil action. Again, we're going to have it bold. And all this is going to be bold, by the way. Civil, and sometimes people abbreviate civil action number. I'm just not going to, since I think our examples show that way. Then on the next line, I'm going to put the case number. Each part of this information gives you data about the case. I'm just going, and you can see the CV means civil, but I'm just going to make up a number that doesn't follow the rules at all, just so we can call it. Okay. So now we have the style of a case. Now you can play around with this. You could have. It's usually this is kind of put in roughly the middle. You don't want to have it at the absolute bottom, at the absolute top. But you don't have to count it up to. I have 3 above and 4 below. That's okay. If that bugs you, if you're kind of OCD about that, you could do this and put it here so it's balanced. Either one's fine. Sometimes you are required to put the particular judge who's handling the case. Now, let me point out one thing. Let's say that you represent Mary Harris, and this is, I forgot the comma here, excuse me. You have a comma here, period here, comma here, period here. If you're representing Mary Harris and this is the initial complaint, you aren't going to know this number when you're preparing this document. That's something that's provided by the clerk's office. And so what you'd have here, traditionally at least, is a line. That would be added to it. But after that initial document, from then on, you'll be using the case number that you're given. That doesn't change. Then you're looking to have the title centered. And this one is Plaintiff's Original Complaint. So that's what we'll call this. Plaintiff's Original Complaint. Again, we're not worrying about why it's called that. We're just typing it up there. And then we're ready to go on and do the rest of the document. So this is a good example of what it can look like. And you can see the mechanics of how it's spaced. There's nothing magical about this. It's just the way we do it here. If you were to go to a different state, they would do it a different way. And so you would just Google that court, look at its local rules, Google to see some examples of filings from that that have been filed with that court, and make sure they're from, say, major law firms in that area so you know they're following the rules, and then just copy the formatting that they're doing. So be open to doing it different ways. And you very likely will need to have several different formatting because most law firms are going to be appearing in more than one court, and there will be subtle differences between where the documents go. Another common difference is that sometimes the name of the document will go over here instead of centered below. Let's look at some options. Okay, I said initially when we began, we talked about how we can make certain fonts the default and how we can take away certain features here that gives us a little bit more control. Let me show you some additional ways that we can format or set up Word so that it does what we want it to do. Now again, for the Word version I have, this is how I get to it. If you are using a different Word version, you may need to go to this a different way, but again, Google it or click on the question mark button and you will get assistance. So I'm going to click on File. Then we'll go down here to the Options button and click on that. And we're going to spend some time on the Display button. As you probably have been seeing in my document, I am showing you all of the formatting. But you've also probably noticed that it kind of is difficult to read, and especially when you're drafting documents, it's kind of hard to see how it's really going to look. So you may, when you're drafting, you probably will when you're drafting, not want to show all of those formatting things. So isn't that nicer looking, easier to read? That can be a much better way of working during the initial stages. Then when you're near the end and you're trying to figure out, so we go back to Display, and we go through and we click on all of these symbols. We're near the end and we're not sure, well, did I hit Tab here? Did I do a space here? You know, all those details. Now when you're kind of nitpicking all these, and you can see even the spaces that you have that dot. So if I accidentally hit the space bar twice, that might not be obvious looking at it without, let me just, here. So I might not immediately see that there are two spaces there. It might not make a big difference, but I may be sufficiently concerned that I want to get that fixed. So turning on the dots can help me see that. So that's a useful thing to kind of turn on and off as you go through documents. Early on, have it off, then turn it on near the end. Let's talk about proofing. There's lots of stuff here I like to focus on. This will tell you the default or the rules that Word will be following in terms of how it will correct your work. And many of the things that Word will do automatically are good things that you will probably want Word to continue to do. But there are some of these things that can get really, really frustrating. For example, imagine that you're writing a document that uses lots of Latin words. Well, if you don't include those Latin words in the dictionary that Word has, every time it sees a Latin word, it's going to say, oh, that's a misspelled word. Well, that's not, it's going to take a lot of your time to click no, ignore, ignore, ignore. So it may be useful either to add those words to the dictionary or to turn off the dictionary function. Again, you might miss some words, though, that should have been corrected, so there's a balance between those two. So it's a good idea to go through the settings under proofing and see that they really are the ones that you want to have. So do you want it to ignore words in uppercase? I usually click on that because if I've made something uppercase, it may be, for example, an abbreviation, maybe NASA or some other term. Well, NASA isn't a word in English, but so that would be a time you probably want to ignore. And then ignore internet file addresses. Do you want it to flag repeated words? And when I say flag, what it'll do is it'll tell you, hey, you wrote the word that twice. Well, sometimes that you want to use the word that twice. But it's probably a good idea that those be flagged so that you can make sure that is what you really want. And again, do you want it to check spelling as you type? Do you want it to tell you, hey, wait a second, let me just do an example here. Let me cancel here. Let's say I type, or let me not do capitals since it won't check for capitals, orange. Look at that. I misspelled it. I left out the A, and it's putting a red underline for it, and that tells me Word thinks it's misspelled. Oh, yeah, it is misspelled. I need the A there, and so now the red line goes away. That's how it can help you figure that out. So go back to proofing. Also, it will mark grammar errors as you type. So let's say I say this. Orange are sweet. Actually, that doesn't recognize this problem. Let's say, how about this one? I was elected mayor. Okay. It has a green line. Oops, wait a second. Well, it had a green line for a second until I blew it. Here we go. Anyway, for some reason I can't make the green line show up. But briefly, there was a green line here. And the green line, it tells you it's a style issue. And what it's objecting to is the passive voice here. Oh, here's the green line. It objects to the passive voice. Passive voice is not grammatically incorrect. And there are times in legal writing where you will want to use passive voice. But generally, it's better not to use passive voice. A good rule of thumb is you don't want more than 10% of your sentences to be in passive voice. Now, there are exceptions to that. So it's a rule of thumb, meaning you're not going to follow it every single case. But if you're above 10%, most of the time you're going to want to challenge the sentences and make sure, hey, do I really need that many sentences in passive voice? A good rule of thumb that I have when I'm going through this is I look at each sentence and I decide, why am I using passive voice here? Is there a good reason? If there is, great. But if there isn't, and I'm just being lazy, I'm not wanting to go to the effort of writing in active voice, then I will rewrite it. And actually, Word will suggest some revisions to make it active voice. You may not like the revisions, but at least it gives you some ideas to work from. So be sure. So you could, here I might change it to say, the citizens elected me mayor. Now we have active voice. And it's not going to be mad about that anymore. Okay, so let's go back to File, to Options, to Proofing. So we've talked about all these things it's going to check. Another thing to check with is, it's going to check grammar twice, as you type and also when you check spelling. And then it's also going to give you readability statistics. And we'll talk about readability statistics in a minute when I give you an example. So let's check writing style. We're going to do grammar and style. You can do just grammar only. If you do grammar only, it's not going to check for passive voice. So I recommend doing grammar and style. And there are some settings here. You can see the various things that it will want to ask you. It's good to look here to make sure that they're checked the way you want to. This is what's called the Oxford comma or the serial comma. A best practice, most legal professionals prefer to use the serial comma. So I would recommend you using always, unless your attorney says, you know, no, don't use it or only use it sometimes. The other thing, this is kind of an interesting point. When I was learning how to type, back in the days of the typewriters, people would put 2 spaces between at the beginning of a sentence. So you'd have the period or the question mark or whatever terminal punctuation you used, then 2 spaces, and then capitalize the beginning of the next sentence. Nowadays, though, 1 space is considered the preferred approach. You'll find a lot of people still use 2 spaces, especially if they are of a certain generation. You follow your own sense in this area, but if your attorney has a preference, obviously you'll want to follow his or her preference. And this will check various things. I recommend that you check them all unless for some reason you think that one or more of these is not something you want to check for. So, but you know, I guess the only one I don't have checked is use the first person. But you certainly could add that if you wanted to. Okay, so I am going to say OK, and I'm going to show you one more feature. We're going to go to File, we're going to go back to Options, we're going to go back to Proofing, and now we're going to talk about autocorrect options. Let me show you an example of this before we do this. Let's say that I was referring to this statute. Let's say we'll do this, the section sign, insert, section. So section 23, section C, Look what happened. Instead of saying that the paren C, it turned it into a copyright symbol. Now I can undo it. I can backspace and undo it. So what I did is I typed open parens, lowercase c, close parens. Actually, let me go back here and do this. So I'm going to do 2, 3, open parens, lowercase c, close parens. Then it'll automatically turn it into a copyright symbol. If I want to undo it, I hit backspace and it's back to what I wanted. Now I can hit forward space and it'll work. But maybe I don't want to deal with that. Maybe I don't deal with copyright symbols at all in my practice. But a lot of times I'm citing statutes that might have a section C to them. And there's also stuff with trademarks and euro signs and things like that. So another one that's fairly common that we have, and this goes back to blue booking. Let's imagine that I want to cite this case. Read the white, comma, 1, 2, 3, F, 3rd, 4, 5, 6, and this is from the Fifth Circuit. Well, you're supposed to do the number 5 and then lowercase th. But guess what's going to happen when I hit space? It's going to superscript, okay? I don't want it to be superscript. That's not correct blue book form. There is a way to fix for this. What you do if you don't want to fix it with changing your options, you do a 5. I usually do several spaces, and for this purpose I like to turn on the spaces so I can see exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to go back and turn on my spaces so I can see this. So I've typed several spaces. Then I go back and do th. Since I'm not hitting the space after it, it's not going to superscript. So let's say that's what this is. So that is a workaround so you don't get the superscript. Those are just kind of two common problems that Word will kind of force you to do a fix around. Let me show you another one that, I'll show you a workaround. This has to do with something, this is another blue booking thing. Let's say instead of this being a Fifth Circuit case, let's say instead this was a Texas appellate decision. So let's say this is from the Dallas Appellate Court. So the way you do this is text, app, period. And what you want here is a M dash. And let me show you how you do an M dash. You need to do a space. Then you do dash, dash, space. And now I'm going to put Dallas. And once I hit the space bar again, my 2 dashes are going to turn into an M dash. Look at this. See how it turned? Let me blow that up so you can see it better because this is kind of a little hard to see. So I'm going to make this a bigger font just for the purposes of this. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to do period here, space, dash, dash, space, Dallas, and when I hit space, it's going to M dash, M dash. Then I have to go back, and I have to get rid of the space here because I'm not supposed to have spaces here. Okay? If I hadn't put those spaces in, the M dash wouldn't automatically work. So those are some workarounds. Everything I just showed you about how to make, how to avoid superscripting, how to keep this not copywriting, and how to do the M dash, you don't need to know for this course. I'm just telling you this because you will need to know this in your career, and I wanted to be the person to share that with you. But let me show you, if you don't want to do these quick little tricks around it, there are ways of avoiding having to do that by setting up. So I'm going to options, I'm going to proofing, and I'm going to autocorrect options. So I'm going to go to auto format, and I am going to, if I don't want it to superscript, for example, I can take that away. I'm going to say yes. And now when I type Fifth, oh, it's still superscripted. I'm not sure why it did that. Anyway, there's a way of doing it so it doesn't superscript. I'm not sure what I did that caused it to superscript. Looks like I turned it off. And here's that M dash. If you don't want the M dash, then you could make that go off. I'm not 100% sure. Here, I think this is what's going to fix it. Let's see if I was successful. There. Okay, so then I turned off the superscript, and now if I do the dash here, space, dash, dash, space, Dallas, it never makes into an in dash. So those are two examples of things you can turn off if you don't want to. You can also turn off that automatic copyright thing. So going to Options, going to Proofing, and go to Autocorrect Options, and we're going to go to Autocorrect. And you can see if you don't want this to happen, I am going to make that go away. Okay, and so now I think it's the case. We'll see if it works. We're going to do open parens C, close parens, and space. It does not turn in the copyright symbol. So if you had to practice, maybe sometimes you need a copyright symbol, sometimes you don't. You can turn that feature on and off. Again, for this class, you won't need to function about those things, but I just wanted to share that information with you. Some rules of, let's go ahead and go to a document. We'll go back to this case right here, the Bradshaw versus Unity Marine Corporation case, which, by the way, is a very fun case to read, but we're not going to read it today. We're going to go to Review, and by the way, you'll find this in different places with different versions of Word. And we're going to do a spelling and grammar check. Now, I'm going to have to click through some things. I'm just going to say Ignore throughout this, because I'm not editing the judge's opinion. So I'll go through this. And when we hit the last button, we've done all of the ignore things. It gives you these statistics because we elected to get these statistics. It tells us how many words, how many characters, meaning, you know, each letter, each comma, each period. It tells us how many paragraphs. It tells us how many sentences. It tells us that our average sentence length is 4 words. So that's misleading because, oops, I'm not going to let me just, you know, it is so ordered it's going to count as a sentence. There may be some other fragments. So that's not, I mean, that's how many sentences per paragraph. But you may have some paragraphs, for example, this might count as a paragraph. Well, obviously it's not really a paragraph. The computer doesn't have a thinking brain like you and I do. It's just looking at, you know, where you have a paragraph sign returned. So this sentence number, this will be artificially low. It says how many words per sentence? 22.5. You ideally want this number to be about 20 or lower. And especially you want it lower when some of your sentences may not be real sentences. They might be kind of super short sentences, so they kind of throw off the average. If your sentence length is over 20 words, it probably means you are causing your reader to work too hard to understand what you're writing. And of course, your goal as a writer is to persuade the reader, right? That's your goal, to get your reader on your side. So the easier you can make his job or her job, the more likely you are to be successful. And so within reason, obviously you don't want it to be run, Dick, run, so simple that it's insulting, but the easier you can make it for that reader to understand what you're saying by keeping your sentences short, by keeping your words short, by keeping your paragraphs short, the more likely it is that the reader is going to be concentrating on your argument as opposed to trying to figure out what you're meaning to say. Now you might be thinking, oh, let me go back here and let's look at the next stack of statistics. You see the first thing is there's almost no passive sentences, so the judge did a very good job here. But you can see that the Flesch-Kincaid grade level is 12th grade. And usually the factors that affect grade level are going to be 3. how long is your average word, so it's 5 letters per word, and this includes words like a, the, and, so words that are very short that are going to be in any sentence in English language. Then also the length of your sentences, and finally the number of passive voice. And so you ideally want this number to be at about 9th grade level, possibly even 8th grade level. You can't always get that low, but that's where you want to be. But you might be thinking, well, if I'm writing this to the judge has a college degree, has a law degree, probably has a really large vocabulary. Why wouldn't I want to present it to him at a college level? Well, again, it goes back to the fact that, yes, he can understand it or she can understand it, but why do you want he or she to work that hard? We all have a variety of vocabulary. We have working everyday words that we know. For example, if you were to say the word little to me, I immediately know what you mean. Let me just actually flip over here for a second. So, let me click that out. So let's say I write the word little, or maybe I write the word small. I know what those words mean. I don't have to pause and think about it. But let's say I use the word minute. The minute shoe. Well, when I see that, my mind, I know what the word minute means. It's a word in my vocabulary, but it's not a word I use every day. And so when I see that, my first thought is the minute shoe. I think, well, that doesn't make sense. Oh yeah, that word minute can also mean minute or small. But guess what? It took me just a split second longer to figure that out. So if the author of that sentence had instead written the small shoe, I wouldn't have to have paused and kind of gotten out of the experience of reading it and kind of thought about my vocabulary. We're talking microseconds here, but that can be the difference between the reader finding it easy to read and understand your document versus having to struggle and work a little bit harder. Doesn't mean he or she can't understand it. It just means he or she is having to work for it more. And why do you want him or her to work when your job is to make their job easy, the reader's job easy? So some rules of thumb. You ideally want the number of passive voice sentences to be 10% or under. If you're above that, go through each sentence and make sure you really need it to be passive. You ideally want your sentence length to be 20 words or less. And you ideally want your reading level to be 9th grade, maybe even less than that if you can manage it. At least as low as you can get it. This concludes the information I wanted to cover today. If you have questions about how to maneuver within Word, please come to my office hours and you and I can play at great length with Word to kind of figure out how you make things happen. If you have a different version of Word and you can't figure out how to make it work, especially if you have a laptop, you're welcome to come and we'll play around with it with your laptop to see if I can figure out how to make that work. Otherwise, you can present the problem to me, and I might be able to help because I have worked with various versions of Word, but I can't guarantee that. I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have questions, please feel free to email me or call me during my office hours or come by. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks for your attention.